Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, everyone. It's my first time I've presented at ALL, so this is going to be a learning experience for me. So, like you said, my name's Don La Barre. I'm originally from kind of a suburb of San Francisco. Over there in that region, I got my BA in anthropology with a concentration in archaeology. I specifically studied rancheros, mestizos, which is like Native American populations converted over to the Catholic system when the missionary systems were in place there. So I worked a lot with Spanish style architecture, rebuilding forts and such. And then I kind of found my love for archaeology and maritime archaeology. And then I moved over to South Australia in Adelaide, about a town of about 1 million people. And so that's where I got my master's degree. And then I came back to the United States, was working contract jobs in San Francisco for development firms and historic and archaeological consulting. And then my girlfriend and I made a bet. She beat me. She got the full-time job up here, and I came flying up. I'm sure some of you might know who she is. My girlfriend's name is Ann Gentry. She's the executive director for the DDA. Yeah, so happens a lot. So she and I, my background is not in historic architecture. I'm not an architect. I am by no means a trained professional in architecture. So if there's something you see that you're like, I'm wondering where he's going with that, I'm coming from this from a different perspective. I'm coming from this from an outsider perspective coming in. This is just something that both Anne and I talk a ton about. We're very passionate about urban design, urban development, and how we preserve and protect our historic places because they matter to us. So we'll get started. So kind of my hope for today, and I'll try to keep, I'm a talker, so I'll keep checking my watch, make sure I'm on point here. My agenda for today is really kind of just really briefly talk about Alpena development, not so much going into a full length history, but I like to kind of touch point. This is something that's still very much in the development. This talk that we're doing today is hopefully going to grow into more research and a more in-depth talk, and we're hoping to present it both statewide and nationally too when we go to these conferences that we're a part of, both for DDA development, historic preservation. We find that when we go to these statewide and national level conferences, we're one, the youngest people there, and two, we're the only people from Northeast Michigan. We see maps, they go, oh, look at all this great stuff we're doing, and then I'll ask the question to the head person, they get mad at me for doing it, but I was like, oh, there's nothing in the Northeast, what's going on there? Oh, well, there's nothing going on. I'm like, you don't understand. There is something going on. You just don't see it because it's not Traverse City. It's not Gaylord. It's not all these other places. Just send someone up and you'll be surprised. And they did. And so we've gotten organizations to come up here and look for future conferences, historic designation looks and such. And they're absolutely blown away with the historic architecture that we have here in Alpena. So it's incredibly something very much to be proud of. And we're really trying to show on a much wider audience what we have here and what's unique to us. So we'll talk about the brief history, styles and form, kind of the different indications of different time periods and different selections, with Greek Revivalist, Georgian as a form, and I'll kind of talk about how those are different in some sense. We'll talk about common misconceptions. First thing I came up here, I had a lot of people reaching out to me going, hey, I'm kind of thinking about doing this and this with the historic building. I specialize in historic building acquisition and sale up here in Michigan. I'm actually helping with a couple commercial properties that are older 19th century buildings right at this moment. So I get a lot of questions, and there's always a lot of misconceptions about what historic preservation is, what it means to preserve a historic building. The biggest one is a lot of people go, well, I don't want the government telling me what to do. I don't want the federal government telling me what I can and can't do with the building. And I understand that as a property owner, I get that concept, but I think it sometimes misses the point of what's trying to be happening. So I'll kind of talk a little bit more about that. Next, kind of the preservation laws that do exist to help people protect our historic infrastructure, types of historic designation, and I repeated the same one in a row, types of historic designation. I must have not copied that right. What are you going to do? So history of Alpena. I know we're all probably fairly literate with Alpena's history. We know that the rise of the city itself came about in the late 1960s. And really what I'm hoping to talk about right here is mainly just, and this is, again, something under development, is talking about major economic shifts in Alpena. We're not talking about slower, gradual growth. I'm talking about, you have all of a sudden you have the lumber industry and huge, massive population flux. And then you have, manufacturing and mining that's retaining and gaining population. So the need for more homes, not just what's already existing, right? And so that's where we're at. So pre-1860s, we're looking at small fishing enterprises, small family base, not a lot of infrastructure being built or homes being built. If they are, they're relatively small shack type homes. Most of these do not exist at this point. There might be a couple examples. I'm just not really privy to which ones those might be at this time. 1868 and beyond, we had the birth of Alpena as a city, started as Fremont, then changed over to Alpena. In 1870 to the 1900s, and please tell me if I'm talking too fast, I have a tendency to do that. We really see between the 1870s and the 1900s, there's a real boom of lumber industry. This is what's advertised as what made Alpena what it is today. State Street, the Fletcher houses, all those homes are on there. A lot of them do come from this era where we're talking about the lumber industry in its prime. Right after the 1900s, we start to see that decrease over time. It can be kind of attributed to over deforestation, changing markets, the more of a stronger move towards the west. A lot of the lumber industries that were prevalent here are now in Oregon. My uncle owns one of them. So that's where a lot of the lumber manufacturing was shifting to. So then Alpena kind of had to go, well, shoot, if we're not a lumber town, what are we? And so in 1900s and beyond, we started to see manufacturing and mining come, and we still see the effects of that, right? So we have Lafarge, Stoneport, all these different manufacturing and mining organizations that are doing shale, limestone, creating raw cement. And then also with that, probably one of the most notable one is the Besser block, right? So the Besser block's known from here to France, all the way to Australia. I've been in Australia, and they were like, oh yeah, this is Besser block. I'm like, you're kidding me, right? And so that's kind of right now the really loose and basic and general like history of Alpena, right? We do know from this time period, we do know that there was 3 major fires: the Great Michigan Fire in 1871, and then following several other major fires that burned down the majority of Alpena. And that's probably why you see a lot of the downtown is brick now. It's not because they go, oh, we'll build it brick, it won't burn. Brick still burns, just maybe not as effectively as wood, but it still burns. But that's why you have so much brick in the downtown. That's why you're just not seeing as many homes of a certain date existing in Alpena, and that's why you have a very select. And so that's, again, very brief, very general history of Alpena. The image on the left that you see was provided by my friend and colleague Jim Burles. He's one of the professors here at ACC. He teaches GIS courses. He's helping me with my archaeology class, and he also teaches the math and sciences. So what this is, the GIS is basically a Google map, in a very layman's term, is basically a digital map, and you can input any data, right? So when you pull up and you want to go to Neiman's and you don't know how to get there, and you go plug in Neiman's, it shows, oh, here's Neiman's, it gives you the directions, right? Kind of the same principle going on here. Each one of these dots is an actual geolocated spot, right? And each one of these dots, because of Jim, has a color coordinated with it. So red being built between the 1850s to 1887, all the way to 1996 and 2013 being in the blue. So you can kind of see the spreading, and I'll be fancy here if I can. So you kind of, this is going to get tricky. I'm just going to sit here. So you can kind of see right here, north side and kind of around the downtown is where our highest concentration of 1850s, the 1887s are. And as you move farther out of the town, almost as if it's a circle that keeps on building upon itself, you start to see this newer growth, right? So the 1960s, 50s, post-World War II, the 1990s, and such are building out in that time too. And what's really cool about this is that, I'll kind of go into it a little bit more, is that when we see the growth of a town, we always see it kind of in a circle pattern, right? It starts at this core, and people are moving there, the homes are denser. I live on Wisner, so my home is really close to my neighbor's home. My lot's long, but I'm very close. As you move farther out, you have different styles of home, right? So you have those post-World War II ideas of the white picket fence. You start going in the 1990s, the suburban infrastructure being built and such. So you have more land and you have newer construction. You're not going to build a McMansion from the 90s, most likely in here, unless you put it right where the old school building is, where they're actually constructing a house right now. So you have a higher density as you go downtown, and as you grow out, these homes start to change in age. And that's exactly what's being shown here. It's pretty common theory. It's pretty easy to understand theory, but it's always really nice when we have these maps to kind of illustrate that point. So we can kind of track the development of Alpena throughout the ages. So properly identifying styles, and this is kind of the core of the presentation, so I hope I don't bore you too much with it. Styles and form. Form is more so what is the structure of the building. We're not talking about, oh, look at that Greek style to it, right? We're talking about the form. We're talking about the roof type. Is it side gabled? Is it front gabled? Is it cross gabled? Is it gambrel? Is it simple? Is it cross hipped? Is it hipped? These are all kind of key forms that we look at in archaeology or in historic preservation or in architectural history to understanding maybe different styles, right? So you wouldn't expect to see, you know, a parallel hipped home up here in Alpena because it wouldn't make sense with the snow, right? You wouldn't expect to see a flat with eaves or a flat with parapet. You might see flat with parapet a little bit downtown just because that's the style of brick building. But in most senses, you won't see a flat top in Alpena, again, because of the snow. So we can kind of estimate what buildings are when they're built based off their forms and stuff in the roofs themselves. Again, it's important knowing all the intricacies, the soffits, the fascia, how to describe these, right? Do you have dental, you know, the little squares that are right where the soffit is or right where that cornice molding would be. And then we kind of go on the foundation. And funny enough, this is how I identify most homes that I actually show. A lot of people going, oh, I think it had an addition on it. You can usually tell right on the line when that addition was done, because you might have, say, something like this, where you have this rubble stone, which is prevalent between 1820s. And this is all fairly Michigan specific time-wise. So 1820s, 1919, we really start seeing this rubble stone, irregular patterns, few cut stones, really just kind of putting it in place. And little regard for finished appearance, right? It's not this artistic style, you're stacking stones for foundation. You know, as you go through time, people add on to homes. You can definitely see this when you walk into a basement, and all of a sudden you'll see a line, and then you'll see blocks come in. And that's when you can kind of tell, you know, from the outside, people put new finish on, they put vinyl on, what have you. It's hard to tell after time, but when you're in the basement, it doesn't lie. When you see the foundation, it doesn't lie. So the foundation is a really important thing for someone like myself, to understand how the building was built, when the building was built. You know, if the house was built in 1868, I'm not going to see block, right? And if I do, it's going to make me ask a lot of questions as to what happened to your foundation. Cut stone blocks, we start seeing this after round blocks in 1880 to about 1905. These are granite blocks, usually. These are more neatly cut and arranged. They're much more systematic. They require more labor, more money, and such when you do that. Then you also have a decorative irregular pattern. I drive First Avenue all the time to get to work. I see this a lot on the homes. And this is from 1890 to 1950, right? So we have still the cut granite stone. It's laid in a irregular pattern, but it's done in a more artistic form, right? So there's a little bit more emphasis on having styled. Probably a great example of that would be, I can't remember the address, but it's on State Street. It's 3rd Street down from Bayview on the right. So it's a gambrel home, kind of a Cape Cod-y looking home. It's very dark, but it's got all this beautiful irregular pattern foundation to it. And the owners actually redid their front patio. It's very similar in some degree to this, and they actually replicated it, which is really hard to do because there's not a lot of people that have the skill sets and the knowledge to do that and match the mortar. A lot of people try to get the job quickly done, but it's always nice when you see someone that has the ability to, you know, match the stone color and match the mortar as well. And then we get brick. You know, in Alpena, we used to make our own brick, which is awesome because you can start telling by the different colors which brick is which. So in brick, you have the soft fired common brick, often used in conjunction with stone. So this is prevalent between 1830s and 1920s. I don't see a ton of this in some of the homes themselves. I see this a lot more in commercial buildings, right? So usually what you'll see is a commercial building where they'll build the basement will be out of a brick form. On the outside, they'll put some form of mortar over the top to decorate it, to kind of hide it or make it look like it had larger stones and such. Then we have concrete, and we're all pretty familiar with the common brick. And this is 1900s to present. This is, you build any home today, unless you specifically ask your contractor to change it up, they're most likely going to do this, which is put this concrete block down. It's often used in conjunction with stone. You can have different forms and styles. For example, the photo on the right is a more decorative pattern than what I have in my house, which is the one on the left. And so you have all these different designs, all this block. A lot of these blocks are provided by Besser in the earlier homes. I think there's a great example on 1st or 2nd Street, pretty close to Grace Lutheran. I'm trying to, maybe you know it. It's like a tan concrete block building. It looks like a Queen's Anne, but it's actually like a modular home for Besser Block, was try to illustrate the Besser Block product, how beautiful it is. Look at, you can recreate, this old Victorian era charm, but with the Besser Block. Isn't this awesome? And it's always wild to me to think that house was like their example of a modular home, which you could like quick build. So they basically ship all the materials to you for the blocks, and you'd be able to build your grand Victorian era Queen's Anne's inspired home. So this is all really important to someone like me when you're identifying a home and what it looks like. By no means is it always a perfect match. By no means are the dates always like absolutely perfect. There's always exceptions. There's always deviations. That's kind of what makes it fun and makes you go crazy a little bit at the same time. Siding types. Again, a lot of this is basically just kind of different styles and such and everything else. But siding types, of course, I didn't put the vinyl in there. Vinyl isn't exactly historic at this point. But clapboard, Dolly Verdon, bevel. I see a lot of clapboard up here. I see a lot of board and batten. Every once in a while, I'll see a tongue and groove. Rustic veneer, shiplap. Everyone loves to put that inside their house these days. So I actually, funny enough, I actually have clapboard in my bathroom. It's not my choice. It was from there before I moved in, but it's a stylistic choice, I guess. But this is all really important too, because you want to understand how they're doing it, which style. What does this indicate? Timeline and everything, all the choices that the homeowner, when they're building a home, what they're making, right? Clapboard is intensive. Dolly Verdon is intensive. A lot of these are pretty intensive type structures to build. But when you have the age of manufacturing and quick product, things like shiplap, interconnecting floors, it becomes much more easier over time. But if you're working with a house, say like if anyone knows Dr. Aiden's house on, I think it's 2nd Street, a beautiful Queen's Anne Victorian era home, that is an insane amount of craftsmanship that goes into that house. And so when you go there, that's an amazing example. It's a perfect example. But there's a lot of homes that are still in that era and that timeline that maybe have the same craftsmanship, but are a little bit harder to identify. Parts of the porch. I won't go too much into it. But porches are really important as well. Porches can either be something that was added on when the home was built at the time. A lot of times you see where someone has a porch that's fallen apart and they've changed it. They made it smaller, they made it bigger. A lot of times you can tell by its columns. When you're looking at the balusters, those are great examples. If you have a Victorian era home and say it's gingerbreaded out, right? So it's got a very like German folklore kind of folk fairy tale gingerbread look to it. You're definitely, always go to the porch to identify that, right? Or in the eaves of the gables as well. So knowing the anatomy of the railing, from the handrails to balusters, the caps, the posts, the columns, these are all really important to understand those terms, because if I go, oh, well, the cap's this, but I'm actually talking about the balusters, makes you look kind of like an idiot, which I've done. So it's just always important to know kind of the anatomy of these different spots, because you can always build a square house built in the 1920s and have it be plain as day, but where someone, an architect, a contractor, or the owner is making their impressions and what's impressing them in the community in terms of the culture, what's in fashion at that time, is going to go into these smaller details because they're more affordable than, say, building or rebuilding a Dr. Aiton type Victorian era home. Styles. So common Michigan house types. Types is form. Again, it's kind of carrying on from these clapboard and such. These are the forms of the house, not so much the style, right? So you can't have a Greek type home, right? It's just the form, right? It's the structure, it's the barn. We do not have a lot of Colonial and Georgian up here. They're much more downstate. If you ignore the Georgian part of it, these homes are probably some of the closer you would get to something that is a Colonial, right? Which is that rectangular, symmetrical, side gabled, 2-story, 2 rooms deep, and usually a central entryway. These are kind of the closest examples I could find up here of that such. And so again, if you disagree with that, I'm more than happy to have that talk. But yeah, so you have the one example on the left, right? That's central. entryway. You have the side gable, 2 rooms deep. This definitely has more, I'd say, French, or I mean, I look at the tile on the top and it's almost like Spanish Revival at some points, but you have basically cedar shake. You have the decorative paneling and sashes on the windows, and then you have that tile on the top, which completely changes the feel and style of the home. So the form of this, you could probably argue, is more of a colonial style form, but with influences from either a French or Spanish revivalist period. It might also be the person was just like, I really like tile on the top. So, but it's all those things are informed, right? You go on your Pinterest board, you go on your magazine, you go in your book, you're inspired by something and you want to influence your own home and how it's styled out. Again, the other example, I'm assuming these guys are Michigan State fans on the right. And this is another good example of maybe a colonial form house. Again, not a perfect example because the window and the door are a little bit different than the top. Usually you see more of the symmetrical window and door arrangement as you would on the left, but that doesn't rule it out. It's just the form, right? Your styles are always changing. It can sometimes be a little tricky. Sometimes you think it's a colonial, but you might also think it might be just a front gabled, and then after time they move the door, right? And so now you're confused. Then we have the gabled front or homestead. These are really common. You see a lot of these on the north side. You do see some of them. I live pretty close to one of them on Wisner. The house was built in 1902. It's probably one of the older homes of that size. But it's just front gabled. They're very standard looking on the exterior. If they have a porch, it's usually a very common porch. It's nothing elaborate. There's not a lot of detail and structure in this. This is on Merchant Street. There's also good examples if you're driving down Miller. There's kind of a couple homes that look a little broken down a little bit, but they're all one in line the other. They're all front gabled homes. Then you get the gabled front and wing. We do not have a lot of these. This is kind of one of the more closest examples I could find of it as an Alpena example. Typically, when you have something, I'm not going to draw it because I'm a bad drawer. So with a gable front and wing, the gable front is almost always taller than the side wing, right? So usually that's a 1-story, and then the front gabled is a 2-story. So you'll see that kind of elevation. This one doesn't have it. That doesn't mean it's not. It just means there's a different type of example of it. But typically you would see it as 2 separate. It can come about either intentionally or it can come out through a remodeling, right? Someone might have a front gabled home, decide I want more space, but doesn't want the 2nd story. They add on the left, and they move the door over. So over time, these homes can go through a variety of stylistic choices and form choices. It just depends on who has it and what time and what they're being influenced by and what Williams-Sonoma catalog they're reading at the time. Then you have a Foursquare. There's not a ton of these. The best examples of Foursquares I can find in Michigan are Boston Edison Historic District down in Detroit. And Foursquare is very, as it sounds, it's basically a very square-shaped home. Typically, they always have that center, that cube shape, the 2.5-story high, the half-story is those top windows. Usually very boxy rooms, and you usually have that center dormer. Again, the dormer is the one with the small window sashes on the top. And usually there's a large porch with wide stairs. Now, does this house have a wide set of stairs? No. Does that make it not a Foursquare? No. It just means a different stylistic choice, right? Now, if you were to take out that view and you went left around the street, all of a sudden you're looking at a very different styled home, right? So it's 2 different styles influencing each other. When you look at the brick matches, so they probably built it the way that it was. So they're probably being influenced by Victorian era styling home, but also Foursquare as well. So again, all these different forms combining to kind of tell a historical story of the owner's choices when they built this. But typically you wouldn't see kind of like this. You wouldn't see typically like a gable on it. Usually it's like a more hip roof like this front is. But if you go on the sides of the building, you'll see front gables. Usually you wouldn't see it on a Foursquare typically. Then we have the Cape Cod. There's a lot of Cape Cod inspired homes here. There's very few actual Cape Cods. And typically a Cape Cod, it can really vary in style and form and how people describe it. A lot of realtors like to call something a Cape Cod, even when it's not, but that's how it goes. Usually a Cape Cod is always a 1.5-story side gable house with a center entryway, usually kind of a master plan first floor, story bedrooms upstairs, mimics small 18th and, sorry for all the grammatical errors in this slide, 18th and 19th century homes of Cape Cod and New England. We have a lot of these. For example, the one on First Street was one that just sold. It used to be I think it was a dental office, right? Or some form of medical office. Yeah. And so this one just sold. I think it's being turned back into a residential property, if I remember right. But if you drove past this, and I told you that was a Cape Cod, you might not automatically think it is because it doesn't have these front gabled. Oh, that's the wrong one. It doesn't have these front gable windows that are usually pretty iconic of Cape Cod. You might go, Don, what are you smoking? There's no way that's a Cape Cod, but it is because it's a 1.5 house, right? It's 1.5 stories. It still has that steep center gable that's going on here. So you have this nice steep protrusion right there in the gables. The door is still center mass in the building. So again, it's just all these different influences and stylistic choices over time. And this is prevalent between 1925 and 1960. There's another example, and I can't remember what it is. It's one of my favorite homes. There's one on State Street that's kind of very Cape Cod influence. It's a beautiful home. And then there's one that's very similar to it. I think on 3rd Street, it's a white building with a kind of a shake style to it. And then you have the ranch. I live in a ranch. There's a lot of ranches. I like ranches. There's nothing wrong with them. Most people call them kind of the manufactured pig of architecture, but I kind of like them. They're kind of fun, and they are indicative of a certain style for sure. Ranches came in 1940. People came back and they wanted to have property. They didn't need to have the big Victorian era home. Those were starting to go to people with a little bit more money or access to ability to fix them up and such. 1940, you see a huge boom. And if you drive anywhere before Ripley, even after Ripley, but especially around the Ripley area to Dunbar, there's a huge amount of ranches. And because, one, they're easy to make. There's not a lot of curves and rounded spaces. There's not a lot of corners. They're easy to make up. They're inexpensive to put up. And usually what you'd see, like in my community on Wisner, is that you'd have a very similar styled ranch house repeating, but with certain windows changes. So you might go to the contractor. Contractor goes, great, I'm going to build these whole 2 streets. This is your choice. This is your square footage choice. These are your window choices. Do you want to have opening windows in your kitchen? Do you want to have that big centered window with side sashes on them and such? So you'd make small stylistic choices on basically a manufactured home. And these worked amazingly well. It kind of opened the manufacturing boom of houses for us. Yeah, this is one of my favorite homes. We know this one, so I don't need to talk about it too much. But styles, right? This is an amazing example of style choices, right? They could have done anything they wanted, but nope, I want a turret. I want the turret 3 stories. I want it all to be stone. I want a semicircle front gabled dormer window. I want the Victorian era fencing on the top. I mean, it's a lot of style, which is awesome. Not everything exudes that much style, but this is kind of that change, right? So this is a Queen Anne Victorian era home, but there's so many more stylistic choices that are in this. There's very few homes that are even like this. And then you have federal style. Okay, yep. So you have federal style. So again, we're going into styles here now. You have federal style 1780, 1840. One of the few examples of federal style buildings up here is the old U.S. Post Office. That's now a residence. I wish it was a place that I could go into all the time and visit and put my office in. That'd be amazing because this building is so cool. And I really love the federal style. You see it a lot in California as well and in the East Coast. But again, delicate classical detailing, dentals. So again, if you don't know what dentals are, it sounds like teeth, but it kind of is exactly what it sounds like. It's all these little teeth right here in the cornice molding. So dentals, it kind of looks like teeth. That's how I remember it. You get the semicircular fan lights, parapet gabled ends. So you get this very, think federally, thinking this very staunch, squarish, kind of large building. And that's kind of how I always remember it. Again, 1780s to 1840s. And again, this is one of the few examples. I think there might be a couple others in the area, but this is the one I always think of when I first go to it. And it's always also in a beautiful location. Italianate. A lot of people don't think we have Italianates up here, and we do. The Centennial Building is one of them. And Centennial Building is one of the very few wedge buildings still in Michigan. And a lot of people don't know we have it up here. And when they find out we have a wedge building up here, I get a lot of calls of very happy people going that are advocate like wedge building people. I didn't know there was a thing, but there is a thing. So it's a beautiful building. It's beautifully constructed. A lot of money went into it. And I think this is always the surprising part to me. When I first came up to Michigan, I was a research intern for the DNR in NOAA, and I stayed in the NOAA sanctuary quarters. I did not venture far out of there. So my experience of Alpena at first was the paper mill, DPI, and NOAA building. I was like, I'm not ever moving here. And then I met my girlfriend, and lo and behold, I left Fletcher Street, and I got to experience more of what was going on in Alpena. And when I saw these buildings, I was like, you got to be kidding me. How do you guys have this up here? And then I started realizing the amount of wealth that was actually, and still is, truly flowing through this community is impressive, because a lot of these brick buildings especially are built by incredibly famous masons and architects that are from Detroit. People were flying, driving, trucking, training, sailing these people up all the time to do this kind of work. And the Centennial Building is really kind of a great example of that. There is a lot of material online. There's a lot of travel journalists that have come up that are interested in architectural history, and they've done pieces on the Centennial Building because it just stands out so well. A lot of people don't know, or maybe this crowd might, but this whole front section is an add-on. So that's why you're starting to see this lighter and darker, lighter, darker. This whole section wasn't there. So that's an add-on that was brought in by the Order when they took over the building. It used to be a bookshop. I think it was one of the first female-owned bookshops in Alpena at one point, and it was music. I think it was a music shop as well. But again, Italianate features. You have, it says square shape, but this is an exception to the example. 2 to 3 stories, ornate eave brackets right up here, really ornate styling up here. And then you have a hip or gabled roof. Again, it's much more a description meant for residential. But this is definitely, you have the rounded windows. It has a very Italian feel to it. It's not hardcore Italianate, but it's definitely stylistically emphasizing some Italian features to it. Dutch Colonial, there's a ton of Dutch Colonials up here. I was really surprised by that. Dutch Colonials were kind of present from 1840s. I say till present because there's a lot of people on their Pinterest boards going like, God, I'd love to own a farmhouse and redo it. And they're kind of going back to this kind of Dutch colonial style to it. And this is kind of one of the better examples of it. I think there's one by you, Jim, right across the street from you. But Dutch colonial is very iconic. It's a kind of a revitalized style that came from the Netherlands in the 1840s, kind of this pursuit of European models. And it's usually 1 to 2 stories. With a side gable or side gambrel roof with little or no rake. The gambrel roofs are a lot easier to identify, but we do have a lot of examples out here. And there's a lot of stylized choices going on here, right? So you do have a raked roof, and then you have all these stylistic cornice pieces. You have the bay windows, the sunken-in door. So you do have a lot of style going on in these homes. There's also an example of it over on the corner of 2nd and Dunbar. It's the red building right across from the Johnson's old house. And then we have the Queen Anne. This is probably like the mothership of home and architects for Alpena. There's a lot of them up here, and they're all incredibly beautiful in their own right. This is very prevalent in terms of a style from 1875 to 1910. So you get this asymmetrical shape, mixed textures. For example, you have this side clapboarding going here, and down here you would have maybe vertical boarding, or maybe you have up here you'd have shakes, like cedar shakes, or what's known as, I call it the fish, it's called like a fish scaling, but basically you'd have, I'm going to do a rough square here, so 3-level house, right? And then you'd have up here you'd have something like this, and alternates, if you get my story. And then down here you might have your clapboard, and then down here you might have a normal shake. And it just alternates like that. So you have different styles. And then when you painted these homes, a lot of people are painting them one color, but traditionally what you'd paint them is, say you want a yellow house, where you have all these splits. So you have 1-story, 2-story, 3-story, and what you would do is all your detailing would be, of course, these vibrant colors that are kind of natural tones. But if you want a yellow building, for say, you'd have a dark mustard, you'd have a middle grade yellow, and all of a sudden you'd have a light yellow. Or if you had a blue, dark blue, middle blue, sky blue. So that was always kind of a very Victorian style. So when you see the home on First Street, there's a home on First Street that just got recently repainted, and it's green, like this kind of yellow, and I think a red of some sorts. And they did a beautiful job painting it. And so a lot of people I find go, oh, I love this Victorian era Queen Anne's. I just would love it in white. And I'm like, you do you, but please don't. It's easier to paint, of course, when you do one color. But again, these Queen Anne style homes are meant to be vibrant. They're meant to be fully beautiful homes. We've done interviews with people that own homes like this, and it's just always amazing the stories and history that we get from this. This house, actually, if you go in, if you ever get the opportunity to go in there, the staircase, when Dr. Ayton bought it, was painted over. And when he scraped up all the paint, he found Brazilian walnut. It used to be considered like plywood, so they would just throw it in, no big deal. So he's restored it, and it's just the amount of different textures of wood that he has throughout the house is absolutely fantastic. I have the aspect Victorian versus Victorian era. I say it all the time. Oh, look at that Victorian home. I always got to stop myself. There's no such thing as a Victorian home. It's a Victorian era home. Victorian is a time period. It's not a style. Queen Anne is the style, right? So whenever someone, for me, it always happens in real estate, buy this beautiful Victorian home, and I just kind of, oh God, okay, but don't call him. Don't be rude. Be a nice guy. Be a nice guy. I'm like, it's a Victorian era home with the Queen Anne styling to it. So it's just kind of always something I always kind of have fun with when I see that. We have Tudor Revival. There's not a lot of historic homes that are Tudor Revival period, but there's definitely newer homes that are. There's a home nearby me that's a more recent construction that has very much a Tudor Revival style, which is an irregular form with half timbering, second floor overhang, and then usually a very steeply pitched roof, casement windows. I just think Bavarian hometown. There's a great example of, I think it's a lakeside house. It's a Tudor style on Gutchess Road. But again, just because it says 1900s and 1935 doesn't mean someone today can't build a Tudor Revival styled home, right? It just means that's when the trend was truly on point. So again, you can see all these different styles kind of coming in at different times throughout history. But again, these are kind of the prevalent times that they were existing. And I was always really surprised, but it makes sense with our kind of a Germanic population up here that you'd eventually find an occasional Tudor. Art Deco. Great examples of Art Deco, the Alpena County Courthouse. It's national. I think it's state listed, or is it? If someone can correct me, I can't remember. It's state. Yeah, it's not federally. It's state listed. It's a beautiful example of an Art Deco building. These glass block windows, corner windows, smooth stucco or cinder block exterior surface, curved corners, and low horizontal roof planes. Another great example is the Jesse Besser house, which is more of an international style home on First Avenue. Also, another great example is the Ella White School. There was a lot of conversation of tearing that building down or not, and it kind of frustrated me because you had an amazing example of basically an Art Deco styled international school building that's really rare to have, and it's really well constructed, and the roof doesn't leak. Sorry, that was my side comment. As you can tell, I like history. MidCentury Modern. I'm a millennial. I'm into this stuff, so I'm sorry. MidCentury Modern is probably one of the hottest items right now in the real estate market outside of Alpena. You go to Detroit, Ann Arbor, Grand Rapids, California. If you have a beautiful mid-century modern home, most likely, not always, but most likely the buyer is going to be someone looking like me. Mid-century modern is very much defined by its often plain look from the public view, and it usually features a flat or a hip roof or very low plain roof. There's another great example of this on Ripley. I was going to take a photo of it, but the guy was outside, and I didn't want to be creepy, like walking around with the camera. Again, it's kind of this mid-century modern is very like a very modern look, kind of blending into and harmonizing with the landscape. Really kind of copying after the Frank Lloyd Wright architecture. So kind of trying to make that for the common people. And this is 1930s and 1970s when this came in. A-frames coming back in the fonts. I would love an A-frame. I don't know, I just think they're beautiful homes. And I really do like how they blend with the landscapes when they do. So that's the brunt of the terminology. That's kind of your go-to guide. There's some readings that I have on the slides at the very end for you. A lot of this material comes from the books that I read. There's one especially that's absolutely fantastic. If you're at all interested in this, I definitely recommend getting this book, and I'll show you at the end. So common misconceptions about historic homes, right? All the time. I have a historic home, and I just want to blow everything out and put it on studs and just make it economically or environmentally friendly. I want to make it so that it has good insulation. The windows are drafty. I don't get the windows. I'm going to take them out, put vinyl in. Historic windows can usually be repaired piece by piece and are thus more sustainable, right? So what's more sustainable? Taking a window out, putting some glazing on it, fixing it up, which is a dense wood, and putting it back in, or throwing that stuff away and then buying a vinyl window or aluminum window that can't be recycled no matter what. Performance of traditional windows are actually proving that they can compete with much more modern double paned replacement windows. If you provide additional insulation, especially like my windows, I have historic wood windows, and in front of it is a storm window. In the middle of winter, -20, I don't feel it coming through the windows. There's no draft. If the windows are maintained, if they're cleaned up, yeah, do you have to go paint it? Probably, but there's plenty of contractors who would do it for you as well. But this is one of the biggest things when people come to me and they go, oh, I just can't deal with my historic windows. They're super drafty. And usually when you go out there and you go, well, here's a problem, your glazing's all gone. If you replace that, you'll have no problems. Now if you have wood rot and all that, so that's another story. But just kind of the parallel is that even though maybe they're not performing perfectly to the highest end, double pane windows, they're still relatively close and better than most Home Depot products you can get. And why is this? So again, explain the math of this a little bit more. On the farthest left is the historic window, and as we go right, it gets more expensive. So if you're looking on the left, you put this is making the example of your historic window, and you put the storm window on. It's going to cost you $50 to do this per window, right? And you have a U value of 1.10 just on the window itself. And basically what's making it, you pay it back, right? So that fix you do is 4.5 years when you do all your windows, right? If you were to put in the latest and greatest windows that cost $550 a piece, and you divide that, you're talking about a much longer period of time to pay this stuff off. I'm not talking about taking out a loan with 3% interest, but the comparison is going, well, if you just fix up the house and you fix up the windows and you recaulk it, you reglaze it, you put that storm window on, you're not only saving money, but you're also making your house more fuel efficient. Now, a lot of people don't go, well, but it's not. It's wood, it's window, it's drafty. Why is that the case? And that's the case right there. You go to Home Depot right now, don't do this, but go to Home Depot, buy a 2x4, and then go to your house, if you have an older home, go into your basement, take your floor joist, cut it out. Again, don't do this. Pull it out and put the two ends together. And what you'll notice is what you're looking at right here. The one on the left is from the 1920s. The one on the right is from modern, probably like 1990s, 2000s. And what do you notice? There's a higher density on the left, right? This wood was wood that was grown over hundreds of years, 50s of years, whatever. It has a higher density and core to the wood itself. Rather than when you get at Home Depot, they're trying to get the fastest wood because there's a shortage of it. They plant it for the sole reason to be cut and used as a 2x4. Now, is it great? Yeah. Is it inexpensive? Yes. But when you put it in, it doesn't perform like the wood on the left. And your wood windows are the density on the left. And when you replace it with the vinyl, you're replacing it with a hollow vinyl, metal vinyl. You ever touch cold metal in the winter, it freezes your hand up. But if you have wood windows like this or wood structure like this is a higher quality wood than you can get today. You can't replicate that unless you go into your backyard and cut the wood yourself. So this is why wood windows, historic features are worth preserving and not just chucking out. That's my spiel on that one. So preservation laws. American Antiquities Act came in 1906. These are the laws that are in state that help protect historic buildings, commercial buildings, residential, memorials, things like that. But the Antiquities Act in 1906 was the first law to really protect historic artifacts and structures. What it really did was it allowed the president at the time to create national monuments from federal lands to protect historic sites. A great example is Chaco Canyon. And then in 1935, we get the Historic Sites Act. And this states that it is a national policy to protect historic sites, artifacts, for public use, right? So over the 19th century into the 20th century and beyond, we start understanding, oh, wait, these places are very special. How do we preserve these places, but also make sure they're not a burden? So this act allowed for organization of federally owned monuments, parks, and sites. And this really put it into the National Park Service and the Secretary of Interior. So a lot of what happened in 1935 now shapes our historic preservation efforts to this day. And then we have the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966. This is kind of the big boy, big girl of the acts for us. And this really put in the infrastructure and how do we do historic preservation. This created a National Register of Historic Places. This is what protects a lot of our shipwrecks off the coastline. This is what protects some of our homes. And protection is a loose word. And then also created the SHPO. Every state in the United States has what's known as a SHPO office, the State Historic Preservation Officer or offices. The SHPO, so example, Center Building, Karen Bennett gets the Center Building, wants to add an elevator in. The SHPO office goes, that's not historic, you can't put the elevator building in. She goes, well, but I have to. It's 3 stories. I got to get people up to the art in the loft. It needs to be ADA compatible. So then they go into discussion and go, okay, well, does this influence this historic character? Does it destroy anything? How does this aid? And then they can make a variance on it to make sure that they can get the certain grant funding, because she was seeking out grant funding to support the building and revitalization of the building. So the SHPO office is there to make sure that when you go, oh, I need to fix up the house, that you're not also adding a condominium off the backyard. So the types of historic designation, and this is kind of where hopefully my spiel hits home a little bit. I get asked a lot of questions. Don, how do I get federally recognized? How do I get state recognized? And will that help me? Yes, it will. And yes, it won't. It's kind of a mixed situation. You have local, state, and federal. You can get state listed and you can get nationally listed. When you do those 2 types of listings, there's a lot of criteria you have to go through. It's not a horrible process if you know what you're doing or if you have someone that knows what they're doing helping you out. But if you want to get it state listed, is it important to the state? You want to get it federally listed, why is it important to the federal government and the United States as a whole? For both of these institutions, federal especially, there are things that make it tax credit available. So if you had a historic building, federally listed, Detroit does this a lot, is that any taxes on the building, and when you say, Ford just bought it, it's huge. I'm not from Michigan, so this is why I'm blanking on the name. Huge building and thank you. Yes. So they have that building. They know it's a historic building. They're doing tax credits on it. Why do you do tax credits on it? Because if you're doing a $50 million project, the taxes are huge. And if you go to them and go, hey, well, if you give me back the taxes that you charge me to have this building, and I put it back into the infrastructure in the building itself, and thereby make that community better because I'm fixing the building even more, you can be eligible for tax credits. So it's a huge incentive to developers. Unfortunately, this kind of tax credit program isn't the best for people that are, say, have a $100,000 house and they're doing a $30,000 fix, right? It's much more meant to encourage developers to not tear down buildings, but to revitalize them. And that's, for me, is a huge thing to have. Some states have a similar program. Michigan does not. We got rid of it. There's currently an effort to bring it back. And this state level would be much more advantageous to a homeowner or small development projects because you're not competing with the $50 million Detroit project done by so-and-so in development for Quicken Loans, right? So the state level is the state is trying to bring it back to some degree. I'm not sure where they're at with that right now, but I know they're still kind of in the throes and the battles to bring it back. Both state and federal is really just an honorary title, right? You're nationally listed, you're state listed. It's great. You put a plaque out, you pay for the plaque, you put the plaque out, and now you have a state listed building. It's really great for tourism. It's great for people to see the history. It's an awesome way with engaging people, but it does not stop those owners from tearing down the building. You know, there's nothing in that legislature that says, well, you have to ask the community first before you tear down the UCC church. So, or tear down State Theater for a better example. That does not protect it from that happening. The best way to protect these kinds of buildings, whether downtown or homes or districts like Hitchcock or State Street, is local. These quasi-judiciary facilities where in a local situation, you have people's eyes on it, you have the community invested in it, and they're the ones creating a historic district or a historic district commission, and they're the ones that really make sure that, say, if someone comes in and goes, I'm buying the State Theater and I'm going to put up vinyl siding in the front, that they're not able to without the community's permission on it or a commission control over it. So it kind of sounds a little bit like big man telling you what to do, but I'll kind of answer why it's not. Local historic districts are, again, that kind of way of protecting your local community's historical assets. They're able to enforce certain guidelines based on the local government's adoption on an ordinance set out by Michigan. Michigan passed the Local Historic Districts Act in 1970, and this allows any community, whether it's a city, whether it's a town, township, county, island, whatever, to bring in historic districts. Mackinac Island, the downtown, is a historic district. Boston Edison is a historic district. There's not a single historic district in Northeast Michigan past Bay City. I don't even think Bay City's got one. You go anywhere else and they are. Traverse City's got one. I think Gaylord's got one. Grayling's got one. Everyone has them except for us. And it's probably a little bit of a reason for that. So the way historic districts are set up is that you establish them in the community, you do your borders, what's protected in it, and then you establish a commission. So a set of officials that are community members that meet to say, if it doesn't do anything to your interior, you want to blow out a wall and make an open concept kitchen, you can do that. But if you want to go outside and add on, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths on the side and put a huge sun porch on the front and it's all going to be made out of aluminum, that's when you're going to start getting into trouble a little bit more. So it's trying to make sure that when you buy these historic homes that have a lot of culture and history in them, that you are still understanding, even though it's your house, that you're still respecting the history and the community, love for these sites and such. So just kind of a quick positive and negative for the National Register of Historic Places and local historic districts. The top one, you get tax benefits, you can get access to grants, and then you also get a Section 106 review. All that means is it's going to the SHPO's office, right? The weaknesses of that, it's really only honorary, it's only just a title. It provides little protection towards the building ever being destroyed. Someone can still come in and demolish it and be like, oh, it's listed, but it's too much work. I just want to build a 2-story ranch house on top of it, destroy it, and then, there's nothing that a National Register of Historic Places can do about protecting that. And then there's also limited local resources to that as well. There's no SHPO representative here in Alpena that's going, hey, these are the listed places. You can come to me if you have more questions. They're all down in Lansing. Local historic districts, their strengths, they provide awesome protection. Once they're instated, it's an amazing way of maintaining and preserving the historic character of a building or a section of buildings. Every time you do anything exterior-wise, it goes through a design review. The DDA kind of has a similar program. If you want to get one of their facade grants for a property, you have to go through a review board session where you present what you're going to do with it, and then they'll say, well, it's important that you keep some type of authentic historic character to the building, right? And so when you tear it off, there's been a couple buildings, one being the what building? I call it the Worth building because that's who owns it. It's a building right next to Center Building that's now red. It used to have that kind of siding. They got a grant. Is it the brick building? No, but they couldn't handle doing the brick rework. So they brought in a facade that was much more conducive towards the local environment, didn't stand out as much. So there's been a couple examples of that being done. And also it's all about the community stewardship, right? So when you have a local historic district, you have people that are invested in that community, people that want to see those homes, people that want to see the beauty of these homes that they provide. And so there's a lot more of a community engagement with a local historic district than, say, a National Register of Historic Places. The weakness of an LHD is that usually they don't have grants, right? They're not a tax-based institution. They're purely volunteer. It'd be like as if I was on the committee. I don't get paid to do it, and I'm not paying anyone to do the work. So that's one of the downfalls of it. So you usually want to have a kind of a complementary setup for it. Establishing a local historic district is incredibly hard sometimes because there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding it. Around it, a lot of people think it's just people telling you what to do with your house. It's really not that. It's people that really care about those buildings and care about what it means to the community and try and do their best to make sure that when you do those fixes that you're honoring that history and that culture that's embedded in those buildings. And it could just be really hard to set those up and explain that. You have to do a lot of education around it. You have to do a lot of door knocking, a lot of sitting down with the right people and going, hey, this is what it is. This is how it looks. This is how it would operate. Here's the infrastructure for it. And usually once you get to that point and you get people looking at it, they'll realize kind of the strengths of it. So a case study. Let me make sure. Yeah. Case study. This is kind of my ending case study. Hopefully I didn't hold you guys too long. But the State Theater is one of the best examples I can think of in Alpena, right? AMC buys it. They join with they buy out Carmichael, and they get the State Theater. State Theater is considered their oldest historic commercial property in their acquisitions that they have. This is the oldest one they own, and they have no idea what to do with it. So So you have the state sign, right? And there was talk of taking the state sign or replacing it or what have you. And there was huge uproar, like massive uproar, which is great. But then a petition went around and the petition was like, well, stop this. Well, petition doesn't do anything, right? If there was something like a historic district commission that was established in this area, the city would be out of their hands, number one. And number two, the developers would have had to come to the local historic district commission and ask them, hey, we want to do this situation, we want to take this out. And usually they go, well, you can't. You can fix it up, but we'd like it to stay there because it's now part of its historic character. Now the funny part is that the old sign is completely different, right? So why is this sign worth saving and not the other sign? Well, it's not there, number one. But let's say the developer came in and said, hey, we love that old look. We want to bring it back. So what is your allegiance to? Do you want it having this look? Do you want it having that look? That's where it can kind of get a little bit gray zone. But kind of back to the AMC example. When they came in, they said, we're going to do it. They got moved forward with it. I saw the plans for it. Didn't like it. But everyone was in an uproar. Everyone was talking about it. It was in the newspapers. It was on TV. People were signing petitions on Facebook. And I guarantee you right now, not a single one of those petitions did anything. Now, why is that? Because they have no legal bounds to them. It's a bunch of people signing a piece of paper, and that's great. It's awesome that people are that committed, but that's not what changed AMC's mind. You know what changed AMC's mind? One person. And that one person worked in that building, and she called and went, hey, there's a lot of upset, and they said, I don't care. Yeah, but the community is really upset. You don't want to change. We don't care. Like, we're a multi-billion-dollar industry. Why do we care about little Alpena? I'm paraphrasing. That was not the conversation. But you can imagine one person calling them and explaining how a community of 10,000 people is like, well, okay, but this is our branding code. We have to have this stuff here. That person made the argument that this was important to the culture, important to the history of the people, and that they would win more points by keeping it and fixing it than getting rid of it. All right? It's one person. One person in the right place, in the right time that worked for them that said, hey, no, you have to do that. It wasn't the petitions, as great as the petitions were, as great as the press was. All it really did was provide her a little bit more of a platform to make that argument. So my question always is, how do we prevent something like that happening again? How do we make sure someone doesn't all of a sudden come in and be like, you know what, I want to get rid of the Center building. Oh, you know what, I want to buy the Centennial Building and get rid of it. These are huge cultural buildings. We would love to see those blocked-in windows again. You go in there and this 3-theater room space to it. There's still the dressing rooms upstairs. It's really creepy up there nowadays, but it's still beautiful. It's still there. And that's the amazing part about Alpena, was that a lot of the fixes they did were really only cosmetic solves. So a lot of it can be undone. And so that undoing, that preserving, that really happens on a local level, not on a federal, not on a state. It happens because there's community members like yourselves who are actively going, okay, we learned from the state theater example. What do we need to do in the future? Because this pissed us off so much. I remember being a kid under the state theater. I had my wedding photos done. I had my kids' senior photos done there. I don't want to see that go. I also don't want to see it fall apart. I want it to be maintained. How do you enforce that? And that's kind of my argument for the local historic districts and putting in an actual legal entity into preserving these spaces. There is a kind of a commission that's supposed to oversee what's now, it's the Armory building that's now like a laser tag zone. And if we know anything, it's a beautiful, huge building and it's falling apart. I'm part of that commission. I don't get any emails to meet, so they don't meet. And that's kind of unfortunate because you do have these beautiful buildings that should be preserved because, again, I'm not from here. I come in here, I go downtown and you go, wow, this building is amazing. This building has so much character. Why the heck is this up here? And it tells a story all the time and gets people coming in for tourism and whatnot, and they come in and they're just surprised at what we have. This is a huge part of Alpena's history and culture, and I really want to make sure that these things are preserved in the right way. Again, when people own these buildings, I always call them stewards, not owners. I know that gets me in trouble every once in a while, but it really is. You're taking on that opportunity to preserve a community's history and culture that's embedded in a place, and that's kind of just the really cool part of it. So that's the end of my case study. So if you like kind of what I talked about, again, I know it's really general, but if you're kind of more interested in what I do and the things that are going on around us, the Michigan Historic Preservation Network is an amazing resource. They are a nonprofit organization. They're the ones that work with all the tax credits. You go to any of their conferences, you will meet architects, engineers, bankers, realtors. I'm probably the only realtor that goes to it, but you meet realtors. You meet historic preservationists, you meet archaeologists, all these different people with all these different kind of connections to historic preservation, and they all go to these guys' conferences. They have access to grants, scholarships, all that different stuff that can be used towards your own home and such. And they're just a really amazing resource to talk to. They do have reps that are supposed to represent this area. She does not come up here a lot because she's based in Lansing, and not a lot of people request her to come up here. So her time up here is very sparingly. But the more people that ask those people to come up, the more we're seeing on the map. AIA Detroit is the American Institute of Architects Guide to Detroit Architecture. Even though it's Detroit specific, there's a lot of similarities between what's going on in Detroit and what's going on up here, right? Because a lot of people were coming up from Detroit and Cleveland and Chicago. So that's an amazing book. The best book I have to recommend is this one on the right, The Field Guide to American Houses. This is like crazy in depth, right? So it has all the different examples, different pictures. It's America specific. It gives you time dates. It gives you information. It's really, really detailed. Anytime someone kind of calls me and goes, hey, what do you think of this house? What do you think it styles? I automatically am pulling that book out, and I'm sitting there going like, okay, I'm seeing this. I'm also seeing this, which usually means this. And usually by the end of it, I can go, okay, I know this, this, and this. I don't need to be an expert to read that book. I don't need to be an expert architect to be able to now go, this is a Queen Anne styled home with a little bit of a Greek revivalist period. I don't know what's going on there, but they put that in there as well for fun. But here's all the different indications that show me that that's that. So it's an amazing, amazing resource. Also, another great resource too is the library. This hyperlink down here, I know you guys won't be able to copy it, but if you just Google historic Alpena tours, this usually is one of the first ones to pop up. The library has been really pivotal in creating audio tours that you can go, and maybe some people have done it, I'm not sure, but you can go building the building and there'll be some type of audio track you can listen to. It's usually connected to your phone. If you have headphones or whatever, you honestly can go in front of the center building, a part of your tour, and hit the tour button, and you can listen to someone talking about the history of it. So the library's really been strongly trying to encourage more of this, because there used to be the historic walks. So I think there used to be, you could go building the building and tour the house. I understand why some owners would probably be like, that's great, but I don't like having my house cleaned 24/7. So this is an amazing alternative where it's less intrusive. So I really hope that the library continues this work, because it's really important collecting those stories. My Anne's father, Joe Gentry, like driving with him downtown is like a history lesson every time I drive. Sometimes I don't want that, but he does it anyways. But the guy can name every single house and every person that moved it and who you know and how you know. And that kind of resource is amazing, because if a building's just pretty, great. But if it has a story, it means so much more to that, because we build these places because they're home, right? It's not just a house, it's not just property, it's a home to us. And when you can kind of share that story, it kind of makes more sense. To me, makes more sense why we would save buildings like the State Theater, why we would save buildings like the Centennial Building, or even the little old ranch house that I live in, because there's a story to it, there's a connection to it, and it's innately human to care about inanimate objects. So, thank you. Thanks. Yep.
Was there any questions? You cover the craftsman.
I did not cover the craftsman style home because I don't know it too well. There is craftsman's up here, but I didn't have the time to take a photo of it. Yeah. I think the craftsman. I had a lot of slides disappearing when I saved this. I did. Oh yeah, it went away. I did have a bungalow style. I don't have the photo on me. There are bungalow styles homes up here as well. A great example of a bungalow would be, gosh, what is that street? Carroll, what street do you live on? Is it Baldwin? I think it's Baldwin. Baldwin first, the red building right on the corner. Bungalow styles kind of falls into semi that craftsman style. So a Baldwin would be, how do I explain this? A huge gabled front, or gabled. Your door would be out here, right? And then you usually typically have some kind of like eaved window like that. And so they're usually like really big window. There's like a couple examples on First Street. So there's bungalows. There's definitely craftsmen up here. There's not a ton of them, but definitely the bungalow, I would have to say, is probably the strongest example that I've seen up here. So.
block that came off the machine.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
it's a crafty-
Is it Craftsman style home? Are there examples up here of that exact home or?
I've seen, you know, a few of
Okay. Yeah. And it would be like would it be like a Besser block home is how they built that? Like with the block style? Okay. Awesome. Yeah. I'll have to look a little bit around. Oh, okay.
he did before he built the home first.
Gotcha. Okay.
Do you have any information on that? It's an old church on Washington, it's that like Petrie's buying income.
Yeah.
Is that being held up because?
I have no idea. All I know about that building is that the owner who bought it passed away or got ill. I can't remember, and I think it's something to do with like the kids are now involved and they don't know what to do with it. That's what I heard, but again, that's the Alpena rumor. So I don't know the exacts what's going on with that building exactly, but yeah, but it's a beautiful building. I didn't touch any of the churches here because there's just so much to cover, but we have amazing churches up here.
Are you talking about the home that says entry?
Yeah.
Okay. I think the fellow from Nick's Diner
Okay.
trying to convert that into a restaurant.
Gotcha.
I know he had a divorce, it was very
Fun.
fun.
Yeah.
And it kind of fell by the wayside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He would like to do it, but
Yeah. Because I know the previous owners were or current owners, I'm not sure, but they were in the process of fixing up the interior. But I do hope that they keep, I mean, the exterior is so beautiful. I really do hope they keep the character that it has alive in it.
I'm third generation in the family home,
Okay.
so I've seen it
Change.
change.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things was my parents in the 50s went to remodel. They were changing the old tall, skinny
Mhm.
windows.
Yeah.
They were removing those and putting in more contemporary type windows.
Yeah.
And they made that cut. A half story of sawdust
Yeah.
came up.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the houses built turn of the century were insulated with sawdust.
Yep. Yeah. It's always kind of funny that kind of insulation. I've seen newspaper, sawdust, horsehair, all that.
Newspaper and sawdust.
Oh, no, lovely. Yeah, that's always the fun part, doing those kind of works and jobs. But yeah, I mean, you see a lot of homes that are historic, older homes. And historic, when I say historic, basically 50 years and older, is usually the legal description of anything historic. So technically, any house built in the 50s or so 60s, 70s, it's considered legally historic at this point. And that's kind of the cool part, because now that's why there's a lot more concentration on the mid-century modern now, is because it's actually now you can legally protect those types of buildings and such. So cool. Awesome. Thank you all.